Welcome to the Explainer, everyone. Buckle up because today we are cracking open a massive historical cold case. For centuries, it's been a rock-solid established fact in our history books that the Roman Empire completely packed up and abandoned the province of Britain in the year 410 AD. But what if I told you that this widely accepted date might be entirely wrong, literally off by decades? Today we're going to dig into the evidence, re-examine the historical scene of the crime, and try to figure out when Roman Britain actually fell.
Our entire understanding of this 410 AD withdrawal is basically pinned to this one specific quote from a 6th century ancient historian named Zosimus. He writes that the Western Roman Emperor at the time, Honorius, essentially told the Romano-British to look after their own affairs. You might have heard of this. It's famously called the Rescript of Honorius. For hundreds of years, this single sentence has been the smoking gun, the definitive proof that the empire just washed its hands of the island. But to really grasp why this letter was supposedly written, we have to understand the absolute sheer chaos that was engulfing the empire at the time.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline to set the scene. Imagine it's December 31st, 406 AD. A massive coalition of barbarians, we're talking Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, cross the frozen, or at least totally unguarded, Rhine River. They shatter the frontier and just pour into Gaul. It's a complete disaster. In response to this existential threat, the Roman legions stationed in Britain rebel in 407 AD, elevating a general named Constantine III as their very own emperor. And if that wasn't crazy enough, just 3 years later in 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric do the unthinkable and actually sack the city of Rome itself. Talk about the perfect storm of imperial collapse, right?
So amidst all this total chaos, it makes total sense that Honorius would just abandon Britain, right? Well, hold on, because here is where our investigation takes a radical turn. Historian Alexander Canducci argues that Zosimus, who is writing from Constantinople a full century later and is, quite frankly, known for being a bit of a muddled historian, made a massive geographical blunder. What if the fall of Roman Britain, exactly as we dated, was based entirely on a simple spelling mistake? I know, it sounds wild, but hear me out.
Compare these two names. We've got Britannia on one side and Bruttium, which is a region in southern Italy, on the other. Now, in Greek, which is the language Zosimus was writing in, these words look incredibly similar. And historically speaking, Honorius writing a letter to Bruttium makes absolute sense. In 410, those same Visigoths who had just sacked Rome were threatening to march south right through Bruttium to seize grain shipments in Africa. Honorius was stuck up in Ravenna, and he had literally no troops to send, so it makes total sense that he wrote to the cities of Bruttium, not Britain, saying, hey, you need to look to your own defenses.
To back up this typo theory even more, we just have to look at how the Roman Empire typically handled losing territory. Spoiler alert, they absolutely hated admitting defeat. When Emperor Aurelian abandoned Dacia back in the 270s, he just carved out a new province south of the Danube and named it Dacia Aureliana to save face. And when Emperor Jovian surrendered parts of Mesopotamia, the tiny little sliver Rome kept was still officially called Mesopotamia. It was all PR. Yet, when we look at official late Roman administrative records like the Notitia Dignitatum, there is zero cover-up, no substitute provinces renamed for Britain at all. If Rome officially withdrew in 410, imperial vanity would have absolutely demanded a fake Britannia somewhere else on the map, and we just don't see it.
So, if Honorius never actually wrote to the Britons, and Rome didn't officially write off the province in 410, well, we have to shift our investigation. If the Roman presence didn't just vanish by imperial decree, we need to ask who exactly stayed behind in Britain to keep the lights on. To figure that out, let's take a look at the troops.
So, the crucial point is that by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman army wasn't just this one massive monolithic block of legions anymore. It was a highly sophisticated two-tiered system. On one hand, you had the comitatenses. These were the highly mobile, elite field armies, dominated by heavy cavalry, designed to quickly react to major threats. On the other hand, you had the limitani. These were the frontier troops, mostly infantry, permanently stationed in forts right along the borders to manage local, day-to-day incursions.
Now, when that usurper Constantine III crossed the English Channel into Gaul in 407 AD to fight the barbarians, he took the mobile field army, the comitatenses, with him. But here is the absolutely critical detail. The frontier troops, the limitani, did not leave. They actually remained right at their posts on Hadrian's Wall in the north and along the forts of the Saxon shore in the south and east. So the military backbone for local defense, it was still very much in place.
With those local troops still manning the walls, we really need to look beyond just military movements to understand what was actually breaking down in Britain.
For that, we have to turn to the most tangible piece of evidence for any civilization, and that's the economy. If we really want to solve this cold case, we need to follow the money.
And this brilliantly illustrates the exact economic shock that hit the island. These are Roman siliquae, silver coins, discovered in British hoards, but I want you to look really closely at their edges. Do you see how they've been brutally clipped? According to numismatic researcher Andrew Burnett, large numbers of these specific silver coins from the late 4th and early 5th centuries have had their edges systematically sheared off. I mean, sometimes right down to the emperor's portrait.
And this wasn't just some rare, occasional thing. In some of the late currency hoards found in Britain, nearly 100% of the coins have been clipped. 100%! This wasn't a slow, gradual shift either. This marks a rapid, severe, and almost complete economic collapse that hit right around the year 409 AD. The intrinsic value of the currency was literally being physically destroyed overnight.
So why does this matter so much? Well, under Roman law, clipping coins was a ridiculously severe crime. We're talking the death penalty. Yet this intense 100% clipping phenomenon is uniquely endemic to Britain. We don't see it happening on this massive scale anywhere else in the empire at this time. This tells us something absolutely vital. While the local frontier soldiers were still standing at their posts, the central administrative authority, the magistrates and imperial officials who actually enforced the laws and managed the economy, they had completely vanished by 409.
So, let's recap. The economy is collapsing, the civil magistrates are totally gone, but the frontier troops are still hanging out at their forts. It is a very messy picture. But if Britain was entirely abandoned and written off by Rome in 410, like the traditional story claims, we have to ask a really perplexing question. Why on earth did the Roman establishment still care so deeply about the spiritual state of the island decades later?
To answer that, we have to introduce a man named Pelagius. He was a Romano-British monk who started teaching a doctrine that, unsurprisingly, came to be known as Pelagianism. Basically, he argued that human beings possessed absolute free will to choose good or evil, and that salvation could be achieved purely through that free will without needing divine grace. In doing so, he was directly challenging the Orthodox Catholic views of original sin, championed by heavyweights like Augustine of Hippo. Needless to say, Rome was not happy and quickly declared it a heresy. Now, what's really interesting about this is the date. In 429 AD, which is almost 20 years after the supposed official abandonment of the province, the Pope dispatched Bishop Germanus of Auxerre all the way from Gaul across the Channel and into Britain just to combat this Pelagian heresy. Think about that for a second. Why would the Roman Church mount a major official expedition to correct the theology of a province that supposedly wasn't even part of their world anymore?
The details we have of Germanus's visit are absolutely fascinating and highly revealing. He travels to the British city of Verulamium and actually holds a massive public debate against the Pelagians. And the records specifically note that these Pelagians were dressed in conspicuous riches, which proves that a wealthy, Romanized elite still existed there. Germanus wins the debate, but he doesn't just stop at theology. He actually takes command of a British military force and leads them to a massive victory against raiding Saxons and Picts. He famously had his troops shout Alleluia right before the battle to startle the enemy. This clearly proves that deep cultural, religious, and even military ties persisted well into the 430s. Let's move to synthesize all this and see how it builds into our final conclusion. When you take the spelling mistake in Zosimus's text, the continued presence of the frontier troops on the wall, the localized breakdown of the silver coin economy, and those ongoing religious missions from the continent, a really clear picture starts to emerge. Roman Britain absolutely did not just fall off a cliff in 410 AD. Instead, it was a slow fade. All the evidence points to a continued, though obviously severely diminished and localized, Roman presence until roughly 435 to 440 AD. When we actually compare the two views side by side, that traditional narrative of a sudden collapse triggered by a single letter from Honorius, it just doesn't hold up to the physical and contextual evidence. The revised view, the idea that central economic and civil authority broke down around 409, but local military, cultural, and religious identities maintained a Romano-British society for another 30 years, is a much more accurate and, frankly, logical reflection of the source material.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider in this explainer.
How do we actually date the end of an era? Does a civilization truly fall the very moment an emperor writes a letter in some distant capital? Or does it fall decades later, when its last silver coins are clipped away to nothing, its frontier troops finally disband, and its local leaders slowly fade into the mist of the Dark Ages? It's a fascinating question and one that really changes how we view history entirely. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember to always keep questioning what you read in the history books.